The Story Without a Name by Barbey de Orville, Chapter 2, translated by Edgar Saltus. The Baroness de Ferjol cared little for the hamlet in which she lived. She was born elsewhere, in Normandy, and her parents were people of rank. It was her marriage, one purely of love, that had thrown her in what, when thinking of the horizons and luxuriant landscapes of her birthplace, she disdainfully described as an ant-hole. The man she loved had brought her there, and for years that love had moved the mountains back and bathed the valley with increasing light. Born Jacqueline Marie Louise Deland, she had been captivated by the Baron, then a captain of an infantry regiment, which, during the last years of the reign of Louis XVI, was quartered at Saint-Sever as a guard against a possible attack by the English. The camp was but a small one, and those who saw it are dead long since. My grandmother was one of the latter. Its officers she had sumptuously entertained, and during my childhood she often spoke of the camp with that accent old people have when speaking of things they have seen. The Baron de Ferjol she had known very well. She had danced with Mademoiselle Deland in the best houses of Saint-Sever, at a time when there was much dancing going on. He had turned the young woman's head completely. He was, my grandmother declared, very handsome. He wore a white uniform, with collars, and facing of blue. He was very fair, moreover, and women think that blue is particularly suited to blondes. The surprise of my grandmother on learning that he had turned Mademoiselle Deland's head had not therefore been very great. He had turned it so completely even that the young woman, who was considered pride itself, consented to an elopement. Mademoiselle Deland was an orphan. The society in which she moved, and which to this day has changed but little, was orderly, moral, religious, Jansenist even. As a consequence, the scandal which her elopement created was terrific. Her guardians had no choice. They consented to her marriage with the Baron, who thereupon took her away to the 7A, where his home was. Unfortunately, the Baron died young. He left his wife in the depths of a mountain funnel, which he had widened by his presence and his love, and of which the walls, tightening in on her, threw another black veil over a heart already in black. With a courage of her own, she remained in that pit. When the sky passed from her heart, she did not try to ascend the suffocating mountains in an effort to find another above her head. She crouched in the gulf in grief of widowhood. For a moment she thought of returning to Normandy, but the memory of her elopement, and the scorn which might have greeted her, prevented. She had no wish to wound her wings against castaments that she herself had broken. Practical as every Norman is, she cared little for the beauty of externals. Where there was none, its absence was unnoticed. There was nothing dreamy about her. Her disposition was not one to be affected by such a thing as homesickness. By nature she was both firm and equable, but her temperament was ardent. That indeed her marriage had only too clearly shown. The ardor, however, was concentrated, and when after the death of her husband she flung herself into religion, suddenly she became severe. The melancholy hamlet in which she was entombed seemed to her quite as fit to live in as to die in. The overhanging mountains that shadowed it suited her perfectly well. When a picture is dreary, the frame should be dark. At the age of 40, the Baroness de Ferjol was a tall, slim brunette, who seemed interiorly illuminated by an unseen fire, one that burned beneath cinders in the marrow of her bones. Women admitted that formerly she had been handsome, but not attractive. They added with that pleasure which such attenuations usually procure. But her beauty, that had been disagreeable to other women merely because it was overwhelming, was buried with the man that she had loved. When he died, she ceased to think of it. He was the one mirror in which she had admired herself, and in losing him who had been to her the universe, she reconveyed the ardor of her love to her child. But the modesty which ardent temperaments frequently possess had prevented her from displaying to her husband the violence of the passion which she had aroused, and in the same manner she concealed her affection from her child, whom she loved more because she was the child of her husband than because she was her own. In fact, because even in maternity she was more wife than mother. With perfect unconsciousness, and with an entire absence of affectation, Madame de Frizzol exhibited to her daughter, and for that matter to everyone else, a sort of rigid majesty, which her daughter, as everyone else, was forced to endure. When you saw her, the unsympathetic ascendancy which she possessed was instantly understood. Her figure, which was that of a matron, her proud and chiselled features, the black coils of her hair, which on the temples were nearly white, rendering them austere and almost cruel, and which in their unpitying grey seemed to have claws to cling with and the rest there among the resisting coils of black. In all this there was something too imperious, too despotic, too Roman for her to have been otherwise than as she was. The sight of her was enough to draw an exclamation from the most ordinary observer, but to a painter or a poet, that wan widow would have recalled the mother of Spartacus, or the mother of Coriolanus, and, mark the stupidity of fate, the woman who possessed this energetic and desolate appearance, who seemed created to tame the haughtiest of rebels, and in the name of their fathers command heroes of war, had absolutely nothing to do save educate and bring up a poor little innocent girl. There was indeed nothing more innocent, nothing more girlish, than Lastiny de Frizzol. She was just emerging from childhood. All her life she had lived in the hamlet, without leaving its sunless humidity once. She was the lily of the valley, the lily that loves the shadows, and grows best in the corners of garden walls where the sun never shines. Lastiny had all the purity of that white flower, and something of its mystery too. In character and physiognomy she differed entirely from her mother. On seeing her, you wondered that such fragility could come from such force. Her face was one that the world considered pretty rather than beautiful, a subject of which the world knows nothing. She was slim-waisted and for her age well developed, a combination noticeable in accomplished women. Her hair was as fair as her father's, the ideal baron who after a fashion of the hour sometimes put pink powder in his own, a little eccentricity that afterwards, at the beginning of the present century, the Abbé de Lille, in spite of his ugliness, but which was atrocious, adopted for himself. But Lastiny had no powder, other than that which is the natural plumage of the melancholy and tender dove. Beneath her hair, her eyes, framed in the dead white of her skin, shone as large and as brilliant as certain mirrors, which, because perhaps of their depth and purity, reflect a shimmer of green. And these eyes, pale grey-green, the colour of a leaf of the willow, lover of the waters, was veiled with long, dark, gold lashes that rested wearily on the porcelain of her cheek. Everything about her resembled them. The languor of her bearing was the languor of those lashes. In my life I have known but one person who possessed that languid charm, and I shall never forget her. She limped, and divinely. Lastiny did not limp, but she seemed to. She had the fascination of women who do limp slightly, and whose limp sways the gown with adorable undulations. Briefly then, in all her being, she exhaled that heavenly weakness before which men of strength and heart bend the knee. She loved her mother, but she feared her. She loved her as certain believers love God, tremblingly. Madame de Frizzol had never shown, and would never show, that abandonment of confidence with mothers whose tenderness overflows inspire their children. And it was with this mother, imposing and mournful, who seemed to live in and share the silence of her husband's tomb, unrestraint and confidence were impossible. And so it came about that Lastiny, thus repelled, lost herself in dream. And in the depths of a cup whose rim was a mountain chain, she lived, deluged with shadows, alone with thoughts, which, unlike the mountain chain, had no zigzag path whereby an ascent could have been effected. She hid her thoughts and feelings, and yet she was artless. Though, to have found that artlessness, you would have had to seek it among the well-springs of her beings, where it bubbled as water bubbles when a hand is plunged beneath the surface. No one had ever thought of plunging into Lastiny's soul. Her mother adored her, and more perhaps because she resembled the man whom she had so wholly loved. She enjoyed her in a silence, she feasted on her without saying a word. Had her piety been a little less fervent, a trifle less rigid, she would have eaten her up with kisses, and in the warmth of caress a heart naturally timid might have unfolded itself like a bud. But, in restraining herself, she restrained her daughter. She held her hand like a wall against the source of those sentiments that seek their rest in a mother's heart, and which, not finding it, flow back. To our own misfortune, the law which governs hearts is crueler than the law that governs things. Once the hand that made the wall and opposed the expansion is withdrawn, the source, freed from the obstacle, begins to flow anew, more impetuously than before. But to the heart that always comes a moment when sentiment absorbs themselves and disappear. Just as blood in mortal wounds ceases to flow through the open flesh. And even then, blood can still be drawn, while sentiments too long restrained coagulate. In this manner, although mother and daughter had never been separated, although in the little details of life they always acted in concert, and although they loved each other dearly, they were alone, isolated in an isolation shared jointly. Madame de Ferjol, who was strong by nature, and who, in the hallucinations of memory, had ever before her the man whom she had loved with a degree of passion that seemed culpable to her now, felt the isolation less than Lasthany. With Lasthany it was different. She had no past. Her dormant faculties were about to awake, and the isolation made her suffer, vaguely, it is true, and more as an indisposition might than actual pain. Yet that was because everything within her was still vague. Then, too, from the cradle up to the present hour of her life, more or less she had always suffered. The misery of life consists in becoming accustomed to certain things, and Lasthany had become as accustomed to the melancholy of her isolated childhood as she had to the melancholy of the land in which she was born, one which dropped upon her its pitiful rays of light, and shut out the horizon with its mountainous walls. She had just become accustomed to these things, just as she had become accustomed to the melancholy solitude of her home. For her mother, who was rich and belonged to an epoch in which the class were to disappear had not ceased to exist, saw very little of the hamlet, where, so far as society went, there was really nothing for a woman like herself. When she had come with her husband, she was so intoxicated with happiness that she would not have stirred for the world. It seemed to her that some of the happiness would be taken from her, that it would be profaned did she permit herself to be drawn into contact with others. And when that happiness passed, with the passing of the man whom she adored, she asked consolation of no one. She lived alone, without manifesting any affectation of solitude or of grief, civil to everyone, but civil with that chill which dismisses without appeal, yet which is without harshness, which does not wound. The little hamlet understood it perfectly. Madame de Ferjol was much above the common run for anyone to be annoyed at the attitude which the death of her husband sufficiently explained. It was taken for granted that she lived only for her daughter, and, knowing the mother to be rich, the possessor of a large estate in Normandy, it was rumored that when the daughter was of marriageable age, she would go back with her to where her estate and fortune were. In the neighborhood there were no suitable suitors for Mademoiselle de Ferjol, and in the event of marriage no one believed that Madame de Ferjol would consent to a separation from her daughter, from whom she had never separated, and whom, even when the question of education arose, she had not permitted to enter the convent of the neighboring town. Madame de Ferjol attended to her daughter's education herself. She taught her all she knew, which was little. But in those days the instruction of young girls of good families was limited to noble sentiments and fine manners, with which they got along very well. Once in society, they divined everything without having learned a thing. Nowadays, they are taught everything and understand nothing. Madame de Ferjol, convinced that, in being near her, Lasthany would always possess the sentiments and manners of her rank, directed her daughter's attention to the worship of God. Tender by nature, endowed with a soul that was tenderness itself, Lasthany turned to religion naturally. In prayer she sought to express those things concerning which her mother never asked, yet in the confidences she gave to an altar she could not forget the possibility of confiding to one who had suffered her to make no confidences at all. And it was perhaps because of that religion failed to bring her the delight it gives to those of unquestionable faith. There was in her something more or something less than that which is requisite to those who are happy only in God and through him. She filled every duty of a Christian with the simplicity of perfect faith. She followed her mother to church, with her visited the poor, partook of communion with her, and yet none of these things placed on the dead white of her forehead the ray of light that belongs to youth. Disturbed by the melancholy which the girl exhibited, and which, in view of the purity of her life, seemed inexplicable, now and again Madame de Fragile would ask, "Is it because you're not fervent enough?" Instead of the doubt and severity of the question, if the mother had only taken the poor child in her arms and let her there pour out all that was in her mind, her eyes and heart, it would have been better for both of them. But that she did not. She even resisted the temptation, and as lastly knew no one but her mother, there was no one in whom she could confide. Her soul was suffocating, and at the time when this story begins, the pity of it is that she did not die of that suffocation.